We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It's going to be this Saturday, and I want to take some time to talk about this, and I want you guys to think about it. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from it. It's not just pivotal, important history of the United States and how it came to be. There's also a number of lessons across a whole wide range of different aspects that we can learn from. Things about community organization, things about combat, things about statecraft, things about intelligence that I want to dig into. So, welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. This one is going to be not an interview. This one is sort of part book review. We'll be looking at the book. I've recommended this book a number of times, Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fisher, that describes not just the battle, but a lot of stuff leading up to it and some of the aftermath, as well as a play-by-play of what actually happened. And the book centers very largely around Paul Revere because Paul Revere is a much more major player in the battle and everything surrounding it than you might think. If you're like most people, you know the poem that talks about the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It's an important piece of history, not the poem, the ride. The poem is pretty historically inaccurate, but Paul Revere had a very important part to play in preparing people for the battle. And it wasn't just on the night of April 18th. It was for weeks and months and years before. And that's one of the things we're going to be getting into. We're also going to be talking about what the battle meant. And we're also going to be talking about some of the lessons that we can pull out of it today. So let's get started. As you know, the battle for Lexington and Concord is something that really kicked off the American War for Independence. Already, everything was brewing. Tensions were high. The American colonies wanted independence and liberty, and the British Crown, but more specifically, Parliament was definitely cracking down on the people. So there was tension, and the tension was growing. And the bigger question in most people's minds was just, what happens next? Where does things go from here? And on the very early morning of April 19th is when the shot heard round the world was fired. The shot that began essentially, very officially, the war for American independence. Prior to that, there had been lots of, I would say, rebellious activity from the colonists. But not all of the rebellious activity was actually that helpful. Now, the British called basically every one of the times that the colonists pushed back rebellious activity. But in many cases, they were not rebelling. They were trying to hold the British officers, the British politicians, the British enforcers to an actual pre-existing legal standard. They were not trying to foment a rebellion. They were not being mutinous. They were trying to hold them to the actual compacts that the colonies had been founded under. And remember that by the time this is happening in New England, in Massachusetts specifically, these are not brand new colonies. England might think they're new because England, even 250 years ago, is a fairly ancient land with tons of history. But these towns that Paul Revere is riding through, these towns that are mustering their militias, these towns that are going to fight back against the British regulars, they're old towns. They've been around for 100 years or 150 years. They have a long track record of governing themselves. They have legal documents with the Crown that go back to the founding of these colonies. They've been incorporated as towns with laws on the books. Those are the things that they are trying to uphold. Those are the reasons. Those are the reasons that they have. Those are the legal standing for pushing back against the Crown and resisting certain things. So one of the things that happens right before the war begins, right before the battle begins, right before everything kicks off in April, is Parliament passes what it calls the Coercive Acts. And the Americans call these the Intolerable Acts. And essentially what the purpose of the coercive or intolerable acts are from Parliament basically to punish Massachusetts and the other colonies and get them in line because they have been a little bit extra feisty lately. They have been doing things which I would call a little bit rebellious, like the Boston Tea Party, to protest the price of tea. And they've also been doing things to protest this tax here. They've also been protesting other things there. But there's this idea. I think we'll go into this more in an upcoming T-Rex Labs video, or possibly T-Rex Arms video. But the popular sentiment on the internet that the American people were so ready to just go to war with Britain, so ready to shoot redcoats, that all it took was one lousy 2% tax on tea, and bam, they started stacking bodies. But the fact is that it was much more complicated than that and much more drawn out than that. There were many offenses against the colonists, and they resisted in many different ways. They remonstrated with the king. They sent ambassadors to go and talk to different people. They had a legal case. They fought back in the courts. They did many, many different things against many, many different offenses, not just the tax. And their main complaint about the stamp tax and the tax on tea was not so much that it was unjust for them to be taxed. It was the taxation without representation. Because remember, these colonies were founded by the colonists, in some cases hundreds of years before, or like 150 years before, by signing a document directly with the King of England. This is a relationship that the colonies have with the king, not with Parliament. And Parliament is the one that is laying down these extra taxes and restrictions against the colonists. And it isn't just taxes. It isn't just adding extra expenses to their paper and their stamps and their tea. There are other things as well. So inside of the intolerable acts, you have things like taking over the port of Massachusetts, the main financial powerhouse of that particular town is now owned by the British. And the governor is going to be a military governor. The entire city is basically going to be under occupation. And elections are over, and the local populace no longer is going to have representative government. They can't even have town meetings without the permission of the military governor, and he will schedule, I think it was 4 a year. So all of their pre-existing government is kind of wiped away by this act, and their ability to maintain their own port and control it and do things with their own ships, that's kind of taken away. And then even the ability to control their own property is kind of taken away because there is this incredibly strict ruling that says that you have to quarter redcoats. And there's some dispute about what this actually means, whether it means that the redcoats can take over any abandoned buildings or the redcoats can take over any buildings. But either way, this very militarized, eminent domain. So these are some of the rulings against the people of Massachusetts that have taken away basically all of their agency, and it is Parliament primarily that is doing this, even though Parliament technically has no jurisdiction over the people of New England. All of these colonies were formed using paperwork filed by the colonists and signed by the king. Parliament doesn't enter into this, but they are the ones that are actually rolling out these restrictions. And there is no recourse, politically speaking, for the colonists. They don't have any members of Parliament, not in the House of Commons or in the House of Lords. There's no way for anyone in the colonies to run for Parliament and have any kind of say in these votes. The guys in Parliament obviously love the idea of taxing the colonies, where no voters live, to enrich the empire and benefit the places where the voters do live. This is the main crux of the issue. But now I want to talk to you about Paul Revere, because Paul Revere is a fascinating figure, and all of these things come to a head, not suddenly, not out of the blue. There is one of my favorite things about this book, in the Paul Revere's Ride book, is at the end, right before all the footnotes, because this is a very well documented work, there are a list of myths, historical myths, and an explanation of some of the different ideas, false ideas or false interpretations about Paul Revere that have emerged over the last 250 years. And one of them is that he is a guy who just acted out of the blue by himself. And that is not the case. Of course, another myth is that he didn't do anything himself at all. There was an entire army of perhaps minorities and more politically correct messengers who could have ridden out and spread the alarm. That is also not correct. We'll go through some of those myths, I guess, a little bit later. But what I will say is Paul Revere is a guy who was preparing for this moment for most of his life. Now, I don't know that he knew that this was the exact moment, but when this moment came, he was ready for it because of a huge amount of work that he had done over the previous few years. But even looking at his early life, you see ways in which this is the direction that he is going. This is the moment that he is going to be ready for. And he's so much more than a messenger. He also is basically the head of an intelligence network that is gathering intelligence and also disseminating it amongst the sons of liberty of the time. But he's kind of more than that. The best way, I think, personally, to understand him is he's a little bit like a tech bro today. He was an artisan. He was a craftsman. He was what was called at the time a mechanic. He was a guy who did things with his hands. We primarily, I think, know him as a silversmith, but he did a whole bunch of stuff. He was a goldsmith. He did dentistry. He did copper plate engraving for most of the newspapers in Britain. So he was working not just on the physical metallurgy of copper and not just the craft of making the art and doing the engraving for the transfer plates for the printing presses, but he was inventing some of the political cartoons of the day, the memes of the day that were driving these different political discussions that were happening around Boston. This enabled him to just be very much involved in the discourse of the day. But his involvement in the community conversation wasn't just because he was making the memes and the political cartoons and working with the newspapers. It goes a little bit deeper than that. He was heavily involved as a community organizer in a bunch of different ways. And it, I think, starts when he's a very young man, and he and a number of other boys, I think it's 5 or 6 other boys in the community, volunteer to be bell ringers at Old North Church. North Church, very important historic church in Boston, still there to this day. You can go and visit it. And it had, up in the steeple, or in the belfry, bells. And the bells at Old North Church at the time were very important. They were the first bells that were cast in North America. They hadn't been brought over from anywhere else. First bells manufactured in this country. And Paul Revere and his friends wrote this very long letter to the elders at Old North Church asking for permission to become bell ringers. They created a bell ringers club of these boys. And they wrote this long document promising to be of good repute and capable of doing this work and not bringing shame on the church and all these things, and then signed their names at the bottom like a little declaration of independence or declaration of dependency. And they did, in fact, ring these bells. I think it was 2 hours of bell ringing every week that they volunteered for. And I don't know this for a fact, but my theory is that Paul Revere was intrigued by the technology and the craftsmanship of these bells in this specific church. But remember that these bells are also a very powerful messaging tool for the community in the town. The church up on the hill ringing out the bells that everybody around can hear. This is what Paul Revere is doing as a very, very young man. This is what he is trying to work. He's building a little team of guys, and he is convincing the elders of the church that he is dependable and he can ring bells, be a messenger, be a credit to his community, and he can get hands-on with some of the latest, best technology of the time. So my theory is that it's the technology that drew him there, but we see some of his other skills come out, and he becomes very much an integral and important part of that Boston community. And you see that in a bunch of different ways. So he was the guy who set up the first street lights in Boston. He was the head of the team that did that. He was the first clerk of the Boston market. He was the founder of the Massachusetts fire insurance company, the first fire insurance company in Massachusetts. I'm not sure that it was the first in the colonies, but it was the first there. And then he was the first president of the Massachusetts Mechanic Association. So he's very much involved in all these different projects that are going on. And he does have some military experience. He was a lieutenant of artillery in the militia, which means that he fought alongside the British in the French and Indian War. He's very plugged into things that are going on, and these are not really things that are necessarily they're not making him a lot of money. I don't think they're bringing him a lot of fame. A lot of these things are just service to the community. Organizing the fire insurance, that did not make him rich. What it did was help the community actually handle the burden of rebuilding after a number of very expensive fires. Being a clerk at the market did not make him rich. Being a lieutenant of artillery in the militia did not bring him a lot of social standing. In fact, this is one of the things that he wasn't particularly good at. The other thing, if you look at Paul Revere, you can see that he works very hard and he tries very hard. He's not exceptional at any of these things. He is not a great military leader in a military context. If you look at his silversmithing, it looks quite good. But if you know about silversmithing, apparently it's not fantastic. He does not stand out as one of the greatest silversmiths in all of human history. He is a very serviceable silversmith. He is a very good engraver of copperplate illustrations. But if you look at his illustrations, they're not amazing. I can think of a lot of political cartoonists that are just a lot better. And I don't know that he was the world's greatest goldsmith or dentist. He is a jack of all trades, and I'm not sure what he actually mastered. It was probably silversmith, but again, people looking at his silverwork say that the soldering is not the best, and the outside gets polished really nicely, but the inside maybe not so much. He's doing so much different stuff that he hasn't really excelled in a particular area. But everything that he's doing is it is at a pretty high level. It's just not the highest level. And his political cartoons are effective, even though they may not be the highest art that America has produced in its young life up to this point. And it's where this political stuff starts to go on that we start to see a little bit more purpose behind what Paul Revere is doing. As relationships with Britain began to sour, he became more politically active, both in the stuff that was printed in the newspapers, but also with the Sons of Liberty. It was his mechanics that took part in the Tea Party. And you can see that there is more than just like a spearheading of organization that he is doing. There's a very complicated system of trust networks that go behind the way that the Tea Party is carried out. Nobody knew who everybody in the Tea Party actually was. There were guys who knew that some people were coming, but everybody had some plausible deniability. And I think that is how Paul Revere ran some of his intelligence networks later on. And it's part of the reason that there is some question or some ambiguity as to how many messengers were raising the hue and cry on April 18th as the British began to march out to Concord. There was a lot of different secret intelligence gathering that was going on at the time. And my theory is that he had multiple overlapping or perhaps not overlapping groups of people bringing him intelligence and disseminating it, because that worked for the Boston Tea Party, and tensions are only rising at this point. Things go from sort of bad to worse until Parliament finally passes these coercive or intolerable acts to punish the people of Massachusetts and really get them in line. And then there is an order given to General Gage to start to confiscate the rebels' weapons and stores and to arrest their leaders. And this is where the conflict gets very, very intense. Everything comes to a head at this point, because you've got to remember that these militias are not necessarily rebel groups. All of these towns are legally required to have a militia. And these leaders that are running the rebellion, in theory, are the community leaders of these towns. Many of them are elected officials. Many of them have important official posts. So what General Gage is being told to do is go into these legally required institutions that the towns have formed. These guys that have legal authority and have jurisdictions, go into their jurisdictions, arrest them, and take their stuff. So this is a direct assault on the legal standing of these towns and their defensive measures and, their entire legal structure, basically. So this is a very significant thing. And I think Gage realizes that it is a significant thing because he tells his officers to muster the men and march 700 of them to Concord and not to open their orders until they're already underway. Part of this, I think, is OPSEC. This is communication security. He doesn't want the word to get out. He doesn't want Concord to be ready. The last 2 times that they have tried to seize gunpowder, it wasn't there by the time that they arrived because the word had gotten out. But I think the other reason is that everybody involved knows that this is an escalation and things are going to get out of hand once they start arresting civic leaders, not just rebel leaders, but the actual elected civil leaders inside of these towns, and stealing the supplies from their legally mandated militias, the very defensive forces that these towns need to have to operate. These militias, by the way, which the British fought alongside pretty recently during the French and Indian War. That's who is being targeted now. And this is where Paul Revere really goes into action. He has a spy network, at least one, and he's gathering information about what the British are doing. And he has a dissemination network. He has friends who will go out and they will get this information to him. And the famous one is, of course, putting lanterns in the steeple of Old North Church. The church where he used to be a bell ringer is now the center of his information communicating system, where he is going to get intelligence as to how the British are going to get to Concord, how the militia should be prepared for their arrival. And he's not just an organizer, because he does ride out to spread the alarm. And there's a bunch of things that happen this night that have become legend. And a lot of the legends are not true. Maybe now is the best time to open up the back of the book. Just FYI, I recommend this book. I don't just recommend Paul Revere's Ride to people who are interested in Paul Revere. I don't just recommend it to people that are interested in Lexington and Concord. I recommend this book to anybody who is interested in history, period, in liberty, period, in America, period. So you should get this book and have a better understanding of what happened. Now, there's a number of different kind of legends that happen, and some of these began immediately after the event. And one of them is there were certain politicians in the United States, they weren't states yet, in the colonies, who downplayed Paul Revere's involvement because they wanted to downplay the level of preparation and intelligence gathering and networks that pre-existed before this happened. Because if the colonists were this level of prepared and ready to go to war with the British regulars, with the redcoats, it kind of lends credence to the idea that there was a flourishing rebellion just itching to kill the redcoats. So there was some downplaying of this even at the time. And then there was also a great elevation of Paul Revere's involvement later on. And the best version of this is, of course, Longfellow wrote the poem, the famous poem, and it is described by David Hack Fisher as the myth of the lone rider. So all of the organization, all of the networks, the Sons of Liberty, all of these things get washed away by the poem, and it's just Paul Revere by himself. One guy at the last minute heroically does the thing that single-handedly turns the tide and starts the thing and the whole deal. And there's several reasons for this to be the case. This is a poem that was written right before the American Civil War. This is a poem that was designed to elevate the individual who is going to save the Union, create the Union. It is not exactly Union propaganda, but it's pretty close. And at this time in history, there is a great deal of interest in kind of the great man theory of politics and of history. You're looking for key individuals who single-handedly do things. That's how stuff gets done. This is kind of the main thinking in the 1860s. And you see this not just in Longfellow, but you see this even later on. Marx talks about this. Freud talks about this. Lots of people talk about this. This is kind of an idea that is circulating at the time. And so guys like Paul Revere get put on pedestals as people who single-handedly did things, not as the organizers of teams necessarily. American heroes are often given this kind of almost tall tale status throughout American history because we like individualism and we like the individual, but this is a time when this is particularly strong. Movements are kind of downplayed in the mid-1800s, and individuals are raised up a little bit. Then came the age of disbelief, where everything has to be questioned, and people are asking, well, did Paul Revere even exist as a person? And if he did he even ride at all? These kinds of things, despite the fact that there is just a huge amount of documented evidence. So all of these different interpretations of Paul Revere reveal more about the thinking of the time or the various historians who put forward these theories than they do about Paul Revere himself. So it's he's a very interesting touchstone. Very interesting touchstone to really see some of the thoughts of the day. During the Vietnam War, you see kind of a similar thing, an even more exaggerated take on Paul Revere as a guy kicking off a war that never should have happened in the first place, saying, well, were the British really that bad? Was Paul Revere really that heroic? Or was he some kind of hothead that kicked off a war that should never have happened in the first place? It's because war should never happen in the first place. And then more recently, Paul Revere has kind of fallen through the cracks a little bit because all of these myths have made him more of a mythic figure than a historic figure. And for the last little while, last several decades, academics and historians have wanted to spend more time on the great orators and the great lawmakers, the highly educated people in academia like themselves. And Paul Revere was not that guy. Paul Revere was this jack of all trades, very blue-collar, pillar of the community guy. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about this interesting situation where I don't think the British fully understood who they were dealing with, either with Paul Revere himself or with the American people. There's this very interesting mismatch that is happening at the time. The first is, I don't think that they had a category for a guy like Paul Revere. Now, they had maybe no real reason to focus on him. When General Gage told his men to seek out the leaders of the rebellion, they were specifically looking for Sam Adams, and they were looking for John Hancock. They were looking for guys who were a little bit more loud, a little bit more public, a little bit more, I would say, drawing more attention to themselves than this guy who is doing a lot of organizing behind the scenes and is doing a lot of the political cartoons. The political cartoons might have actually moved the needle more than some of the great speeches, but again, there's a tendency to look at the great speeches and kind of ignore the guy engraving those copper plate panels. So that's an interesting one. But the other thing is, they don't have a great understanding of a guy like Paul Revere. Paul Revere is somebody of great importance and great respect and great standing within his community, but he also isn't a gentleman as the British would have seen him. He is still such a blue-collar guy that maybe he kind of falls through the cracks for them as well. Like in London, you would have guys who are starting fire insurance companies. You would have guys who are the clerks of the markets, and you would have guys who are organizing the folks who are installing lampposts and streetlights. But the difference is, in London, the guys organizing that stuff would not have been the guys who are actually making the streetlights and putting them in himself with the rest of his team of mechanics. It's just a very different situation. And so a guy like Paul Revere would kind of slip through their fingers a little bit, which is actually what happened to him on the night of April 18th. Not only did he get captured by the British, but he wasn't on their really high-value target list, and he managed to escape in some of the later confusion. So it's just kind of interesting to me to think about the kind of guy that he was, and he kind of represents a major difference between Britain and the colonies at this time. It was guys like Paul Revere who really made this country great and really enabled a lot of this stuff. I don't want to downplay John Hancock. I don't want to downplay either John Adams or Sam Adams. These guys are incredibly important parts of the puzzle. I don't want to throw too much shade at Thomas Jefferson. At this time, he was hugely valuable and important and contributed a lot. But it was all of these speakers and planners and writers, as great as they were, they wouldn't have gotten very far without the doers. And there were so many guys like Paul Revere actually putting in a tremendous amount of work than actually making some of this stuff possible. And I think that is something that the British at the time sort of missed. I think the British sentiment also missed out on the motivations of the American people. This would have been Parliament, this would have been General Gage, this would have been most of the officers. They were looking for those few rabble-rousers. They believed that if they could just grab a couple of these leaders, a couple of these mutineers, these very rich guys like John Hancock or these very loud guys like Sam Adams, the problem would just go away, and the rest of the people would just sort of fall in line under the British leadership that they should have had all along. This is the way that Britain is running their new colonies in India, extremely top-down, directly controlled by Parliament and the British Empire back in what is now the United Kingdom. What they don't understand is that it isn't just a few rabble-rousers, and it isn't just a few community organizers like Paul Revere. The entire countryside rose up when they heard that the British were coming, not just to do a snap inspection of a thing, not just to collect some taxes from somebody who is delinquent, but to confiscate military supplies from a town militia, and that they were looking to arrest certain leaders who hadn't broken any laws. When this happened, there were almost immediately 4,000 militiamen on the field ready to fight the 700 Redcoats. And then, by the end of the day, by the end of April 19th, there were about 20,000 men who were out ready to fight the Redcoats. Now, that seems like a pretty easy thing to do today. You could generate a lot of furor and interest against Redcoats today on the internet, get 10,000 likes on Twitter, 20,000 likes on Twitter. It's not that big a deal. But remember that getting people into the field at a time when information cannot travel faster than horseback. But you got to remember that back then, getting information out and disseminated amongst people when information cannot travel faster than a guy on horseback is a big deal. And you also have to remember that getting people out to fight the British is kind of a big deal because they wouldn't have called them British. One thing that is absolutely definitely a myth is that Paul Revere rode around yelling, "The British are coming." He did not say that for sure because everybody in the colonies considered themselves to be British. We're still over a year away from the Declaration of Independence being signed. The colonies are in no way considering themselves independent from Britain at this time. They are British colonies, self-governed British colonies full of Englishmen. In fact, one of the men describes his justification for fighting the Redcoats is to keep them out of his house because every Englishman's home is his castle. They are standing on English common law, and they are citing as their authority to do this the laws that have been signed by the King of England, admittedly over a century ago. So these are the reasons for resisting these encroachers. But it is kind of a big deal. Later on, we have independent nations fighting an invading nation. These are separate countries, and going to war with separate companies is clean and nice, and at least it's delineated that way. What we have at the beginning of the war, in April 19th, is something very different. You have the lesser magistrates, essentially, these official militias of these towns, operating at this low-level jurisdiction in their area, shooting and killing British officers of the Crown, largely directed by Parliament, but operating up at this level, but technically outside of their jurisdiction because they're violating the lower jurisdiction of the militia. And because they had an understanding that this was acceptable, they fought back and killed British officers and British regulars. And they did so in relatively large quantities. 4,000 men responded immediately, and that number rose over time. As the British regulars retreated back to Boston, they were continually engaged by the militias that they had passed on the way. Now, there's several reasons why the colonists, the militia members, were ready and willing to do this. One was the seriousness of what the British regulars were doing. Arresting people who had not committed a crime, even under the Intolerable Acts, was a big deal. And confiscating supplies and arms, taking weapons away from the militias, from the free Englishmen of the colonies, was a big deal. That was beyond the pale. It was beyond anything that had happened with taxes or with seizing of goods or forfeiture or stuff like that. This was a big enough deal that they were ready to fight back. But the second reason that they were ready to do this was lots and lots of teaching and preparation. And again, not all of it came from a few charismatic leaders. It didn't come from guys who were very outspoken like Sam Adams, and it didn't come from guys who were very rich like John Hancock. It came from the pastors of the time. It came from the pulpits of the time. There had been teaching about spheres of sovereignty. It wasn't called that at the time, but there had been teaching about limited jurisdictions for a considerable amount of time in the colonies. The people were very well prepared for some of these moral arguments as they unfolded. So I think it is unhelpful to look just at how annoyed the people were at taxes or how the people were annoyed at the Boston Massacre, and then at some point, the tensions just get to this point and they boil over and they start shooting redcoats. It's actually, I think, more helpful to look at their definitions of justice and injustice and look at the actions of the redcoats and see that when the redcoats' injustice reaches a certain level of unlawfulness, it becomes lawful to resist them, because that is the way that the colonists saw it. And it took a serious amount of teaching and preaching and writing and reading and conversation and discussion to get people to this level of clear understanding. And this is what I think the British really did not anticipate. There was a huge amount of, at this point we would call it grassroots level support for these ideas. The Americans did not just want freedom as a word. They did not just want liberty as a political ideal. They had already been operating with such a level of personal responsibility and personal freedom across all of these ideas and engaged in these ideas that they could operate on their own. Paul Revere did not have to give them battle plans. Paul Revere did not have to give them justifications. That had already happened. All he had to tell them was what the British were doing and where the British were going. They already had everything else already set up. The Minutemen, very famously, were ready to fight within a minute, but they didn't get there in a minute. They had to spend days of gathering information and being prepared for this conflict. They had to spend weeks or months of thinking through some of the different practical or strategic or tactical implications of what they would actually do on different greens or around different bridges. And they would have done this not so much to fight the British, but this would have been how they planned mustering and doing combat against any enemies, Indians or maybe possibly redcoats. There would have been months and years of teaching on some of these concepts inside of the pulpits, and there would have been years and decades of people building up community relationships. And again, these towns had been here, most of them, for over a century. So even though England believes that America has gone from stewing rebellion to outright rebellion overnight, this happens over a long course of time, and it requires a lot of extremely deliberate preparation and requires total involvement from the people. Now, obviously, there were loyalists. There were people who were more sympathetic to the British. There were people who were not swayed by these arguments, or there were people who were just not ready for it to turn into a hot war, a shooting war. But generally speaking, those 4,000 men who responded immediately and were joined by another 16,000 men later on, those people were fully committed to this project of maintaining their own sovereignty and their own independence, and it wasn't just a hot-headed thing. Now, I'm sure there were hot-headed guys in there, because that's how guys work. But the people, in general, understood what a serious undertaking this was and what it meant for the future. I want you to read this book because I think it does a really good job of going through kind of what was involved. It's very easy to picture, especially if you've just heard the poem or like read a children's book. Picture a guy riding out in the middle of the night and people just step out onto their front yards and shoot at some redcoats and Yankee Doodle plays in the background and George Washington appears and we become an American country with the 4th of July and all the stuff afterwards. If you read this book about the long march that happened, the seriously difficult conditions of the mud, some of the bureaucratic nonsense that the redcoats had to deal with. If you read this book and you see what was involved for the colonists themselves, some of the hardships that they had already endured, some of the wounds that were taken. This was a serious undertaking. This was extremely miserable for a lot of people. This was a big deal, and everybody knew it at the time. And I want to just read a quote from. This is a quote from Captain Levi Preston. It's about halfway through the book, and it describes kind of the motivations that we've just been talking about. This was an interview that happened many years after the war. Somebody was asking Captain Preston, "Why did you go to the Concord fight?" "What did I go for?" the old man said, subtly rephrasing the historian's question to drain away its determinism. The interview tried again. "Were you oppressed by the Stamp Act?" "I never saw any stamps," Preston answered. "And I also understood that none were ever sold." "What about the tea tax?" "Tea tax? I never drank a drop of the stuff. The boys all threw it overboard." "But I suppose you had been reading Harrington and Sidney and Locke about the eternal principles of liberty." "I never heard of those men. The only books we had were the Bible, the Catechism, Watts' Psalms and Hymns, and the Almanacs." "Well then, what was the matter?" "Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to, and they didn't mean that we should." I think the great misunderstanding, both of the British then and of Americans now who simplify what the colonists were thinking at the time, is they're kind of missing this point. American colonies had been founded by people who were doing the work of building a nation so that they could be self-governed. And they'd had, in these New England towns, over a century of doing that. And it hadn't been easy. If you read about the early colonies and the hard winters up in Plymouth, if you read about some of the Indian wars, if you read about some of the difficulties of setting up governments and having to execute your first murderers, your first capital criminals, if you read about some of these things as they develop, these great hardships that the first colonists dealt with to build this country, and the fact that they were governing themselves, the fact that they developed their own relationships between the colonists. And they kind of relied on the king to settle some of these different things because that was what the compacts were. Those were the agreements that they had with the crown. But you also have just an awful lot of Atlantic Ocean between you and England. So a lot of this work they had done themselves. And as time goes on and they become a richer and more taxable nation, and as England starts to build its new colonies in India and govern its colonies in a different way, and as Parliament gathers more and more power, and you've had the English Civil War, And there is a move towards greater freedom inside of the United Kingdom as power is taken away from the king and Parliament takes more and it becomes a little bit more balanced. But then the pendulum kind of swings the other way with Charles II, and then the pendulum swings again with George III. America did not want to be dragged around with a lot of these different power struggles. America did not want to be governed by Parliament. America never had been governed by Parliament, and Parliament had no jurisdiction here. America had always governed itself. America had always built itself a certain way, and that is the reason that they didn't have gentlemen quite like England had. They had gentlemen like Paul Revere, a guy who was maybe not the world's greatest silversmith, maybe not the world's greatest orator, but he could serve his community in a way where his community was ready to follow his lead. And there were men out in the middle of nowhere, out in these towns that maybe British people kind of looked down their noses at and thought that they could just move in, arrest a few mutineers, capture their guns and their gunpowder, and then they would toe the line. But these guys had generations of building civilization on this land. They had governed themselves, and they meant to keep doing it. So I want us to remember that these are the principles behind this thing that happened here. It wasn't just they got tired of paying a stamp tax when in fact no stamps were ever sold. It was deeper principles that were involved, and the preparation for it was considerable. You don't get that kind of community serving mindset overnight. You don't get those kinds of towns overnight. You don't get those kinds of relationships overnight. You don't get those kind of churches overnight. One of the points that I forgot to mention earlier is not only do you have some of these messages being preached from the pulpit, but many of the militias are being organized within the church structure themselves, not as a function, an ecclesiological function of the church, but because the church is the center of town, because the deacons are leaders of men. You see guys like Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark was one of the deacons of one of the churches, and he was connected both to the leaders. When the two men, Hancock and Sam Adams, were being hunted by the Redcoats, they were actually in Jonas Clark's house. But he is the deacon of that church, and he is the leader of that militia. He had been training them for years prior to this event. None of this stuff happened overnight. It was very carefully thought through, and it took a massive amount of work to get there. And guys like Paul Revere put in a huge amount of the effort, not only on the night, but in that preparatory part. And then to wrap up the story of Paul Revere, it's kind of interesting to me. After the war, obviously there were leaders who took on greater leadership responsibilities. George Washington obviously became the first president. Thomas Jefferson and the other guys had a massive amount of responsibility that they took inside of Congress and the constitutional conventions and places like that. And Paul Revere isn't there for that. Paul Revere continues to serve in his community in Boston. So he's a health inspector for a while. He's the coroner for a while. He continues to do all of these things and grow his business and take care of his 16 children. I forgot to mention that he was the father of 16 children. And the book does mention that he feels a little bit left out, that he didn't go on to be involved in all of these larger, bigger parts of building the nation and writing the Constitution and things like that. But he nevertheless continued to serve. And I don't think we should look down on him for continuing to do that smaller work. And I think we should recognize that I'm sure that at times it was extremely difficult and unpleasant, being the guy who organizes the first fire insurance because there have been a spate of devastating fires is not a fun setting up a cool new business opportunity. Being a health inspector and coroner because there is a plague going on is not the most fun time to do that. And he did outlive 10 of his 16 children. A lot of the men who were involved in the war for American independence lost a lot. Many of them lost their lives. Many of them lost their fortunes, but they maintained their sacred honor. And one of the cool things about Paul Revere, he was able to grow his own business to the point where he was technically able to cast his own bells, which if we were making a movie would be like the final like happy ending to this thing. But this is not a movie. This is a podcast, so it has to have a call to action in it. It's very possible, it's extremely possible, very likely that you don't have what it takes to be the next Thomas Jefferson or John Hancock or Sam Adams. But you probably do have what it takes if you just put in the work to be a Paul Revere or a Jonas Clark. These are the guys who often become magnified when it suits certain historians and diminished when it suits other historians, but they were really pivotal to the way that America maintained its freedom. I would argue that we did not get freedom for the first time after we defeated the British. We maintained the kind of freedom and liberty that we were founded on from the beginning. The original colonists came over to this new world to build these things, and their great-great-great-grandchildren fought to maintain those things, and were successful, largely because of the efforts of guys like Paul Revere. Not great generals, apparently not even good lieutenants, not great orators, but pretty good at political cartoons. Guys who occasionally would have a moment, a night of greatness that people would turn into poems later, but only after just probably thankless years and years and years of working in their local town and city, building relationships and building out capabilities in their community. That is not only the thing that is needed now, that is a thing that is needed all the time. And when you put in that work and that preparation, only then will you be ready for those unexpected and pivotal nights like April 18th. So that is my encouragement to you. First of all, get the book and read the book. But second of all, try to figure out how you can be building those kinds of things, building those kind of things into yourself, those capabilities, but also building those things into your community. Paul Revere did not probably create this long laundry list of occupations that he would hold in the future, knowing that they would be handy if certain things happened. He did all those things because they served an immediate need for other people. And then, in 1775, the full sum total of the things that he had worked on, and the skills that he had gathered, and the relationships that he had, and the trust that he had built, those all came into play at just the right moment for something that was really important. So, go work on some of those things.